In this part of the beginner's guide, we're going to be going over some basic character rigging. And this is going to be your basic Spline IK tube style bendy arm type rigging. So this will work great for any characters where the body doesn't really need to deform along with the limbs. So we're going to have some pretty nice controls over that. And we'll see, while it does work best on simpler limbs, we are going to be starting with a character that does have some detail in those limbs, in the arms and legs. And we'll see we can still make it work pretty well. We'll also go over how to set up some facial rigging for eyes, mouths, eyebrows, even using pose morphs, as well as Xpresso, even some custom user data to make things easier to control. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, what we're going to do here is get started with SpongeBob here for his arms and legs. We'll use a different character for the facial stuff. SpongeBob here, since he's all polygons, is a little bit trickier to do some face stuff, though we will kind of talk about and go over maybe some things we could do or things to keep in mind with it. Now, before we dive in, both of my arms and legs here, of course, I only have one, and it is the right side. The character's right. Are set up to kind of deform and bend well. So, you definitely need some additional segments and edges for this. They're also kind of stuck into our character. So that way, when we go to move them, we don't get like kind of floaty limbs there. All right. Lastly, I don't have any rotations on here. And there are a couple of different ways you can get rid of rotations should you have them on your limbs. First would just be to freeze it. That should zero them out here. That might still lead to some issues. So another option would be to export your character as an OBJ and then bring it back in to import it or merge it in. And that should get rid of the rotations completely. It's what I did with this character here. So let's start with the arm here. I'm going to go to a front view. I'm going to solo this arm, and precision does matter here. So, I'm going to make sure I start here at the shoulder, in the middle as best I can. Same with the elbow. Put it in the middle in between those two edge loops, and then at the fingers here. Notice how I'm not trying to follow the fingers down here. And in a perfect world, the center of the shoulder would be the same center of the arm and probably even match the fingers, though a little bend at the fingers isn't a bad idea if you are going to be rigging them. That's a bit more than what we'll get into with this example though. So that looks pretty good. I do want to make sure everything is completely zeroed out though. So I'm going to select all of those points of my spline and zero them out on the y-axis. Okay, and then if I need to, adjust it a little bit up or down to center it. I'll then switch to a top view because I will need to center it there, but I'm also going to center my axis. So center axis 2, and then center that as well. Once again, the more things align, the middle of the shoulder to the middle of the arm to the middle of the hand, the better off you'll be. Same with the overall height of the shoulder, compared to the hand. You can see how that's a bit off. That can potentially cause some issues too. So I could have just used like a little tube arm, and some of these things wouldn't have mattered as much, the center, the shoulder and the hand not matching up, but I wanted to go with something a little bit more complex because it is absolutely possible. All right, so with our spline, let's name it. Naming is going to be important here as we start to get into this more complex setup. And now on our arm, what we can do is add a spline wrap. As a child, I'm going to hold shift to do that. Notice how the spline wrap, fits around it, adjusts its bounding box, but also notice where the middle of that spline wrap is. And this is, one of those issues I was talking about where the middle of our spline wrap doesn't quite match where our spline is. And so if we don't move the spline, it's going to move our arm, which then can, change our model a bit. So I will move this a little bit, but that can potentially lead to issues because, now things are no longer quite where they line up, where we may want them to bend. So just keep that in mind. Okay. So I can move that there. Now my object tab, dragging my spline to the spline field, my arm spline that is. You may want to adjust the axis. Thankfully I built my arm along the positive x-axis. So that's what I was using here. And with that, you might need to adjust the mode for your limb to keep length or fit. If you make your spline the same size or same length, then that won't be a problem. And you can decide what to do kind of at the end here as well. All right, at this point, we can kind of see if things are working or if we're going to run into any issues. If you select your spline, go into point mode and select the middle point, we need to give the elbow a little bit of a bend. But if we start moving this and things start popping, that's going to let us know that, yeah, we have some problems. And, it might have been because the middle of the spline wrap didn't match, our geometry or our spline, right? Like we're seeing here, it's not in the middle of our arm, but we can still make this work. Okay. So a couple of different ways you can do this. And it's in the rotation section here. I can get rid of my coordinate manager for now. But what I think helps is moving that point until it pops so we can see what we need to do to fix it. So that looks good. What I'll do is select the spline wrap again, and I can either work with the up vector to see if one of these ways will fix it. And because in my spline wrap, I was using the x-axis, that's why the up vector here is doing what I needed to do. If you had to use a different axis here, I would try that up vector first, but you can see -1 works. You can also just rotate this 180 degrees or adjust the banking to 180, and that should fix it as well. All right, we'll still get some popping when we come back here to the absolute straight part, but I don't think that will be a problem in the long run. So whichever of those methods you want to do, I think the up vector is just a bit better. All right, I don't know why. Lower numbers make me feel better, I guess. And I do have just a slight bend. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to want to adjust my spline a little bit because as of right now, this spline just has this hard point. And so what I can do is right click with that point selected and use soft interpolation. And that's going to give me a much smoother kind of bend in my arm. We may not be seeing it quite yet, right? But if that was smooth, there's hard interpolation. So smooth is going to work better. And you could also potentially work with the different type of spline here, say B-spline. That can sometimes help give you a smooth, curvy, bendy arm, or some of the other ones. I typically stick with Bezier, but you do need to be careful of the width of your handles there. That can potentially cause some problems. So it wouldn't be a bad idea just to maybe move those in a little bit before getting too much further. But I think for this, that will work just fine. All right, so that looks good. And yeah, I'm going to bring this so we just have that little bit of bend, right? Notice now how we can get just a bit further with that soft interpolation. So that looks good. Maybe push it just a little bit more. There we go. And now to finish this up, we're going to add our rigging IK tag. We're going to need to turn on point IK because we're using a spline that has points. Now, Cinema 4D starts numbering its points at 0. So that should be here in our shoulder. So that will be 0. We had 1 point here for the elbow. Our second point is at the hand. So this goes to 2. And then we can just hit add goal, and that will add a null at the very end here. We're going to call this right arm control. Okay. And now what we should see is if we move this, what do you know? Our arm is moving. Now notice how we are getting some intersecting there. So we will have to be a bit careful there. There are some limitations with this. I wasn't expecting that much rotating quite yet. All right, there we go. Looks like it was just the Y position of this kind of making that do some things I wasn't expecting. Okay, so that looks good. And what you can do here is change the shape to make it a little bit easier to see, something like a circle, just the radius, whether it faces the camera or if you want it to face, kind of the arm there, right? So that looks pretty good. Okay. Another control we're probably going to want is the elbow, to be able to kind of control the angle of the elbow, whether we want it to be up, down, that type of thing. So what I'll do is find the add pole, add that. Okay. Name the pole. You can see it already kind of named it for us, but we can just call it elbow. And I'm going to position this kind of behind the arm, right? By the elbow. And that will allow us to control the angle of it. And just to kind of demonstrate that, there's that. You can see now, oops, move the spline. We want our elbow, should be right elbow. We'll have to change that. We can move it up or down. So let's change that to right elbow. And what I'm trying to do here is kind of move everything back, or at least the arm control back where it was. The elbow, I like where it is. You can change its shape too to maybe, a diamond All right, that looks good. And adjust the orientation. Maybe we want Z. All right, that is looking pretty good. And what I would probably do at this point, or actually before we do that, is now place everything in our arm null. Okay, that's going to make it easy to mirror here in a second. Okay, and what I would do to finish this up, all right, is select our arm control, come here and freeze our position. Okay, that's going to leave us with a position of 0, 0, 0. So it's very easy to get back to this T-pose. Same thing with our elbow. Freeze the position. Okay, so that way, if I decide I'm moving this around and I want to kind of get things back the way they were, all I have to do, right click, and there we go. So our right arm is done, right? We'll mirror these things over at the end. And now what we can do is move over to our leg. Although I think I will just hide that spline wrap just to make things a little bit easier to see here. Okay, and it's really the same process for the leg. You can go to a side view, pen tool, and same type of thing where, actually should have just had that selected when I soloed this. I'm gonna start at the top here, although we really don't want it at the top since that isn't ultimately where I want it to bend, but same thing. Do that. And what I'm saying by that is I don't want this top part to bend. I really want it to only bend kind of there. But the problem is if I do that, then it'll change the length of our leg. So that should still work though. So that looks centered pretty well, but let's flatten it out first on, should be the Z axis here, coordinate manager, Z axis, right? Go to say our front view now. Make sure this is centered in the leg this way. Oh, I guess our guy's kind of backwards, isn't he? No, I take that back. That's the right. Though maybe I'm confused. Does happen occasionally. So there we go. Centered. Once again, kind of the shoe isn't quite centered to the leg. You know, that is something that if I had made this model, I would have been a bit more careful of. But I did not make it, so I can't complain too much. All right, so that spline is where we want it. We're gonna now take our leg, do the same thing as before, add our spline wrap to it. And just like we did previously, you know, the spline is not quite centered here. Now, what's a bit strange is the spline wrap is trying to go along the positive x-axis, and I don't want that. So I'm going to need to adjust that. And so I'm gonna want, I think I'm gonna want negative y here. All right, so the arrow's pointing down. But yeah, that's really where I want that spline. And I won't move it this time just so you can see what happens. Let's name this. All right. Put that, actually don't need to put it in there yet, but drag that into our spline field here. And notice how it kind of moved to it, but it also rotated strangely. And so once again, up vector may help with this. You can see positive X this time seems to have done the trick. Our bounding box doesn't quite match up either. And you know, sometimes this can be a problem, sometimes it isn't. If you want to adjust that, you need to adjust the bounding box center. And you can see how moving it on the Z axis here, you know, works pretty good. I do want to try and get this, as close as possible. At least spend a second doing it. If I want to make this just a bit larger to help me with that, I absolutely can. So I think we want a negative 3.5 or so. Yeah, that looks good. We'll see what issues we run into with this. Right? Once again, that's kind of the part of this, not to give the perfect example that doesn't, you know, glosses over a lot of the common problems you may run into. Hopefully going to cover, or have been covering, lots of those. So our spline wrap is all set. Remember, just like we did with our previous one, we want to give this just a bit of a bend so it knows where we want it. And what do you know? No popping. So, you know, not moving the spline, recentering the box if we needed to, perhaps that is what we needed to do. You can see how we're seeing the top of the leg here. That is where that keep length might have helped, okay? Turns out it really didn't for whatever reason, but we just may need to be a bit careful of that when we're working with this, or perhaps extend the leg up before. But that's fine. You know, I don't know how much we'll see underneath, so that can work at least for this example. That's a bit too much though, so we want just a little bit. There we go. Repeat the process. Rigging spline, or I'm sorry, just regular IK, but we want point IK. Set the end to 2 because once again, 0, 1, and 2. Add a goal. Okay, see where that goal is. It's at the bottom. Just test it out. Looks good. No kind of reversing, which is awesome. There we go. Call this. And once again, I want to be consistent. So if I called this right arm control, then I want this to be right leg control. All right, and use whatever shape I want. Maybe this time I use a rectangle, switch it to Y for the orientation. And you could certainly adjust the aspect ratio if you wanted to, you know, kind of make it more foot sized, more foot like. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. You know, once again, you can always hide the deformer or, oops, not the leg, the deformer if you want to kind of clean things up. So now we have our leg control, just like we did. There we go, looking good. And we're gonna want the knee control as well, just like we wanted for the elbow, same thing. Add pole, this we'll call right knee. And with this, let's see, do just in front and go to a front view here, make sure it's centered. Right? Probably should be a bit more precise than that, but should be okay. And that's pretty much it for our leg. I mean, I guess the only thing, I didn't notice it previously, but if we want to adjust the spline here to change the curve of this, we absolutely can, just like we did last time. So let's see, maybe we just come in here and do soft interpolation, select our control. See, yeah. Looks pretty good. If you wanted a little bit more bend in the knee, you know, once again, different intermediate points type, different spline types, or even just working with the handles to kind of give you more of like a hard knee shape or not, though. If, at least with this model, with the hard, you can start to get, you know, some intersecting perhaps. So different things to kind of play with depending on the type of character and look you want. But that's looking pretty good. Just like I did with these, I'll put all of this in our right leg, take my controls and freeze their positions. So that way they're all at 0. And once again, easy to kind of get back to and reset. So that'll do it for the legs. All right, so let's go ahead and mirror this over. I do want to point out on our leg here, on the knee, I did give it a shape, just the old locator. That way we can see that a little bit better. And let's start with the leg here when it comes to using our mirror tool. So can come over here to character, choose mirror tool. And, you know, if you've kind of set things up the way I have, then there isn't a whole lot to change here. And what I mean by that is we've have things on the positive x-axis that we want it to go on the negative, right? So x-axis positive to negative, and that is world coordinate and world origin. No options really for naming. That is something we want to change. We want to replace the R underscore, which we named everything for our right side, to L underscore for left side. We have no weights, so all we need to do is hit mirror. And what do you know? There's our new left leg. Let's go ahead and test it. So left leg control. Looking good. All right, all done there. Now for the arm, this gets a little bit trickier, but still not all that crazy. Select the right arm, come up here to character and choose mirror tool. And really all we should have to do is hit mirror, but you'll notice that it's kind of backwards. And that's because of some of the things we did in our spline wrap here. So what I'm going to first try is just setting this positive X to minus X. And that looks okay, right? At least it's the arm's going the right way. And then lastly, I'll zero out the banking, or do the zero out your up vector. Now what we can do is just test this and make sure it works. And what do you know? It does. So keep in mind, if you do some extra things to the spline wrap, that can cause it to have some issues. Now, what I don't know is why we had to do the X, the rotation, the banking or up vector. That I understand because it didn't know to go in and do that. But this negative X, I guess it makes sense because our geometry is now along the negative X. But I still would have thought the mirror tool would have gotten that. And perhaps there's an option in there I missed. But with that, we have now finished setting up the limbs here, and we'll switch to our different character and start talking about facial animation. So this is the character we're going to be using for all the facial setup. He is set up pretty much the same way as we saw with SpongeBob earlier, right? Same kind of controls here for the arms and legs. I do want to point out that the organization is different. So I moved all these controls into a separate null called controls. All the splines are in their own null as well. You know, organization here is going to be important, but there are plenty of different ways you could do this based on personal preference. Same with, you know, the different shapes and positioning of them. What I have done though with everything is put it in kind of a master character null that, you know, is at the bottom. So if we were trying to make them walk, that would be easy. But also so we can move everything very easily. Depending on if your controls are inside or outside of a null like that, can kind of change how that movement works. So I just wanted to point that out. But let's get started here with the mouth, as that's probably a bit of the simpler stuff. And for the mouth, what we can do is actually duplicate the mouth itself several times. So we'll call this, just take, you know, mouth. We're going to name these kind of our different expressions we want. They could also be different phonemes if you were going to have a character kind of speak. And you can Google all the different mouth shapes for those. But I think that's about all I'm going to need are just these three here. And I'll put these after I move them off to the side so that we can see them and work with them into their own null. So that way I have them and can hide them and don't have to worry about seeing them. But here we have our different face shapes. And technically, you know, the one we started with could be used for happy, but I do think it's a good idea to just start with one from scratch. And we're just going to go through and make these really quick. So I tried to keep them simple so I wouldn't have to spend too much time working on them. So here, this one's just going to be kind of a circle shape. You do want to keep in mind though how these points move, if they move up or down, because that's how it's going to eventually morph. So for the circle here, I don't mind if this comes up a little bit, maybe that goes down a little, and then these just kind of need to be centered here, something, like this. And I'll select all these points if I'm in a rectangle selection and switch the type to soft selection, which should give me something similar to a circle. That should work for this. The frown's a little bit more complicated, but we'll try to get through this as fast as we can. We're going to want this to move up, and then really these points to move down. And you can see we don't quite get something very nice here. So I'll just switch this to soft interpolation. I'll try and get that on screen so we can see it. So that actually isn't too bad. You do want to be a bit careful about symmetry with this though. So, that's definitely something that would slow me down here as I'm trying to do this as quickly as possible and would want to spend more time making sure everything's symmetrical, but I think something like that looks pretty good. All right. And yeah, we want to be a little bit mindful of kind of shapes of this, but that looks like it will work pretty well, even though I'm not 100% sold on that circle shape. And we do want to make any kind of adjustments to this before we go too much further. Let's call this null mouth shapes, and we'll go ahead and actually not hide them yet, but definitely from the render, at least for now. Probably would move them kind of out of the way as well. And now what we're going to do is on the mouth geometry, we are going to add a pose morph tag. So that's going to be under our rigging tags and pose morph. So now what we need to do is tell it what we're going to mix or be morphing here. And that's going to be points. And I wanted to go back and actually I'll undo that. I'm going to save points for last. I want to check hierarchy as well because our mouth does have a couple of objects inside. I wanted to make sure it's looking at all of those. So I'll also do points now, and now it'll switch. So if I didn't keep that or make a new shape for happy, I would just need to keep this pose 0 in here. But because I got rid of that. I can just keep that there. And now all I have to do is drag in my different poses. And as I drag in my different poses or mouth shapes, it's going to ask me if I want to do absolute or relative. And because we kind of move these off to the side away from the original here, we're going to want to do relative. So I'll do that, drag in happy. It's even going to take the name for me. I can go with relative again for kind of the O shape, drag in frown, no again. And then once I'm happy with this, switch this to animate. And at this point, I can hide my mouth shapes. Could even delete them, though I'm not sure I'd recommend it if for whatever reason you want to redo this setup. And now what we have is on our pose morph here, all these different sliders to control our facial expressions. So happy doesn't really do anything because that was the base one, but still can be helpful to have. So you can see there's our first shape, there's our second shape, and you can see how the morphing kind of in blending happens, and we want to be careful with that. Something else I should mention with the pose morph is that you can only change facial expressions or really anything when it comes to changing the shapes here by pushing and pulling. You don't want to weld, you can't add points or anything like that. So make sure your geometry has all the points that you're going to need in order to change the shape to whatever you want. And that's what's also important, thinking back to the SpongeBob character, and I'll try and show that at the end here, is that there was a lot of detail there that was going to make it hard to kind of morph that into the different shapes and facial expressions we wanted. Okay, so our mouth shapes done, taken care of. Okay, there is a little bit of a problem though, and that is that the controls for this are all the way down here on our mouth. And probably when we're animating, you know, we're going to be worried about the controls and not the mouth all the way down this hierarchy here. So that's where having something like, let's just move the mouth shapes down there. Our control null here, because we can add user data and add these controls onto it so that we really only have to focus on the controls section here. And the way we're going to do that is by selecting our null, coming here to user data and choosing add user data. Okay, now the first thing I'm going to do is add a group. Okay, and we can name this group, say, mouth, right? Something like that. And then we can take a data that was already created or even add a new one, which we'll do here in a second, and make it a child of it. But let's kind of go through this first. First, we want to give this a name. And so we could call this happy, even though I don't think we really need to do that one in particular. It's going to set the name happy here. We need to decide what type of data that's going to be. What type of information is this property going to be? Because when you think about it, Cinema 4D has lots of different data types, okay? Anything from materials to lights, to colors, all of that stuff, okay? Now, I can't click on it to show you, but it was in fact a % for the pose morph strength there. So the float here is going to work just fine. We can choose the type of interface we want. We're seeing a preview of it right down here. And so because the pose morph was a slider, I'm going to choose float slider here. Okay. And we could also go with float slider no edit field, but I like to have that edit field just so we can set exact values if we would like to. We can keep the unit as %, since that's what the pose morph was. And you can set limits. And in the case of %, you can see 0 to 100 is kind of the default, and that works just fine. And so now that I've made this, I'm going to just hit add data to create another one, and we'll call this O, and pretty much set it up the same way, where really the only thing we changed was the interface. So I'll do float slider, and that should be it. Just double checking, add one more, make sure that's frown, and same thing. And once we've done that, I can hit OK. And now we have a tab in our controls null here where we have these different sliders, except I forgot to add the slider for the frown. Thankfully, I can come back in and I should be able to just fix that. There we go. Make sure you hit OK. Perfect. Now we have our sliders for this. All right. We can have different groups. We can collapse, expand, whether it's for eyes, whether it's for eyebrows, that type of thing. And so the last step is to connect these properties here to our user data here. And to do that, we're going to need to use Xpresso. And it's not going to be terribly difficult because this is kind of a one-to-one setup here. Now, what we could do is come over here to pose morph, or actually our controls first, right click and use a simple expression that would set up the Xpresso for us, where you would do set driver on, say, happy on our user data. Come over here to our mouth, the pose morph, right click on that property, go to expressions and do set driven. And we can do absolute here because these are very similar properties. And now what's going to happen is the happy strength of this pose morph will now be controlled by the strength here. So if I set this to 100%, notice how it's 100% here. Now, what's actually happening is Cinema 4D is creating an Xpresso tag for us where it is doing the heavy lifting. Okay, and we'll see how to set this up without that here shortly, but it's essentially taking our user data that's on our controls null, and it's taking the end result of that, connecting it to a range mapper. And this would also be if you wanted to use a different range, or if you wanted to use a relative range of values from one property to another. So if you didn't want it to be, the exact same value here equals the exact same value there, and it's connecting it to the correct property on our pose morph, the happy strength. The problem with doing expressions like that, especially on complicated, semi-complicated rigs like this, we're trying to keep it simple, is that you're going to end up with a bunch of Xpresso tags when really you want like one Xpresso tag with everything in it for simplicity's sake, for organization, and to make Cinema 4D's life a little bit easier. So we could keep doing the expression thing, and if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But here's how I would do this. I would create another null, because nulls are our friends here. Call this Xpresso, bring it into our controls, put it at the very bottom. Okay. We're going to right click on it, go to our programming tags and choose Xpresso. And that's going to pop up our Xpresso editor here, which I can make a bit larger. And from this, what we can do is drag in our controls null, or whatever object we're going to want to work with here, and also drag in our pose morph tag. And we technically don't need to use the range mapper here because we're going one-to-one. Okay, but what we're going to be doing is taking the controls, and you can see a list of all the different properties, literally anything on this object. So it can be a bit tricky to find. In this case, the user data is a bit easy. So you can see it's at the bottom here. It's in our group mouth. And so I can choose happy to add that property there. I can choose O and then frown. And I'm going to need to connect those to the tag properties here. And it took me a while to find these the first time I did this, but you'll notice that they're all right here. So we have our frown, enable, and strength. Not sure why you'd want enable, but there it is. Happy, strength, O, strength. And so those are going to be the ones I want. And the good news is if you get these out of order, if that's something that's going to bother you, you can just reorder them and it will fix them for us. Now all we need to do is connect these together. So our happy control is going to control the happy strength, O to O, and frown to frown. Okay, we should be able to close that. And now when we want to work with these, it should all be done in our user data here, and we shouldn't have to worry about the pose morph tag. And once again, that's just going to help simplify things because everything's going to be in an easier to find spot. It's going to be more convenient. We're not going to have to go down our hierarchies here. And so that will just make our lives easier. It'll make the animators' lives easier. And that's the whole point of rigging, is to simplify the setup process as well as the animation process and make it as streamlined as possible. So I mentioned SpongeBob and kind of the difficulties we'd have with getting facial expressions with him, and that's because this is a polygon object with lots of polygons, so more than I would probably want here. Not only that, we have several objects kind of connected or combined into one that are going to make it hard to kind of change the facial expression here, right? We have the teeth, which are kind of just stuck in there, same with the tongue. And so if I was to use my mesh brush here, maybe to like grab something, you can see how the teeth don't really go with it. Even the tongue, I mean, I can kind of do stuff on its own, but that's just going to add to this as I try to, change the facial expression here, right? And you can see, I'm not doing a great job here wasn't really planning on doing too much, but you can see how hard that can be. You know, if I have to move the tongue out of the way to get the mouth kind of in a place that I like. All right, so you can see while it is possible to get something, I'm not sure what to call this, it's going to be trickier because this mesh really wasn't set up for that or intended for this. So it is possible to do it with polygon objects, and using something like soft selection or, you know, our mesh brushes are going to be the best way of doing that. But it's going to be complicated if your geometry wasn't kind of prepped the right way for that. And that's what I wanted to touch on. Now, for the eyebrows, it's going to be pretty much the exact same process. In fact, I'd probably be better off kind of combining the eyebrows into a single object. And that way I could just kind of make them up or down, since that's probably what I would want. The good news is I can use the same shapes for both regardless, since they were made the same way. So we'll just do two. Once again, put these in a null. All right, that way if we want to change them, you can say like mad, do one that's straight just for fun. We'll start with the straight one because that's going to be the easiest to do here. Come into our point mode, select all the points. And I'm going to use my attribute manager to flatten these out on the y-axis. So just like that. And with the mad, much like the frown, I'm tempted just to rotate it. Or maybe we can even just kind of scale it and have it kind of go the other way to something like that, I think would be just fine. We do want to be a bit careful though with, once again, how these points moved and how they moved relative to the other ones, because that is going to matter. Now the same thing here on my eyebrows. We'll do it with the right eyebrow. I'll only do it for one because the process would be the same for both here. Rigging tags, pose morph. Okay, once again, check hierarchy first and then points. We can keep our base pose in there and we'll just call that, say, happy. We'll take the straight one, add that. That's going to be relative. So we'll hit no. We'll take mad, drag that in, relative, hit no. We're all set to animate. We want to test it out here. And wouldn't you know, well, it's pretty close. It isn't quite there, that it's, you know, intersecting this a bit. Now, the good news is, because of the way this is set up, I absolutely could just raise the eyebrow entirely up a little bit, though I'd want to make sure I do it to both of them. In fact, once I have this set up, I absolutely could just duplicate it and move it over for the left eyebrow as well, rather than kind of resetting everything up here. But we have our controls, and once again, didn't really need happy, but there it is. And I would do the same thing now that we did previously with the Xpresso on our user data. So that was mouth. We can go back to our user data, manage. I would add maybe another group for eyebrows. Is eyebrows one word or two? We're going with one word here. We'll add more data, right? And we'll just call this straight. And once again, float slider with the percent. We'll add one more. This will be frown, and we'll do float slider, and we should be able to hit OK. And what I'm going to do is, rather than create another Xpresso tag, I will go back into this one and I will do the same thing. Drag in. Actually, I'm not even sure we need to drag in another copy of our controls null, or if that would even work. We can just come here in eyebrows, do frown, and do straight. And in fact, that may be a good reason to drag in another copy of it, because it can be hard to see or differentiate between those. So I probably would do this on a different, node or different copy of our controls, but just to kind of, once again, kind of keep things simple in our Xpresso, we can do that. Another thing that would help is if I actually name these properties a little bit differently. And in fact, I believe that's what the kind of the short name is for here. So if we come in here to our user data, and if for the short name, I just did like EB and hit enter, I wonder if that will change it in Xpresso. No, it doesn't look like it did. It is changing it there. So, okay, and that's something we could definitely change the name of manually if we wanted to. We are going to have to drag in the other pose morph though for the eyebrow. And once again, we're going to want to come here to tag properties and just choose the ones we want. So mad, looks like I kind of mislabeled these, or at least wasn't consistent. And that is definitely something you want to do. Make sure you are consistent with your naming. So even that short name I changed, which I'm a bit surprised it didn't show up here, though. I guess I was confused. But yeah, I mean, even, mad to frown, that may make sense, but definitely want to be as consistent as possible. So we have that. Can close this. We can see what we get now on our controls. We have eyebrows. We have a way to make it straight and a way to make it frown. We screwed up our user data yet again when it comes to, there we go, the float slider and having the percent there. Great. And you can see how, wow, that makes it even more advanced. So that's how we would do the eyebrow. Now, what I should have done for the second eyebrow is definitely name these like left or right. So why don't we do that? Just because that's going to bother me. So let's see, that would be the character's right. So we'll do right. And let's just get rid of that since it's not showing up. Frown, right, frown. Get rid of that. And it makes me wonder if we're going to need to do the same for the shorts. Why don't we just do that just to be on the safe side? All right. So there we go. We have our right. And, honestly, like I said, after you set up both, you could maybe add a third group here that controlled both eyebrows at once, since you may want to just have them change at the same time. But that would just be the same process we went through. And so it's not worth really getting into here. But yeah, that's how we would set up our eyebrows. Now, what we're going to do is work with the eyes and get some control so we can rotate them and tell our character what he should be looking at. So what we're going to do is select both eyeballs. Okay, now I have a little bit of a complicated setup here where I have a null with the eyeball in it with a pupil inside of it, right? Just, so we can have some different things like that if we want an upper eyelid and a lower eyelid as well to try and make the character blink. And we'll get to that. So I'm going to choose the actual, eyeball for both the left and right. And what I'm going to do is hold shift and create a null. So that null gets placed inside of it. You could also just create the null and make it a child of the eyeball and then zero out its X, Y, and Z position, rotations, all of that. Okay. I'll take both of those nulls, drag them to my controls here. Now I want to make sure I get the naming right here. That is my left eye. So we'll say left eye, look. This is going to be then the right eye, look, and we will select both of these, move them in front of our character. How far is entirely up to you. It's not going to change anything we're doing here. And we're going to select them again so we can go into the Object tab, switch their display to rectangle, or really whatever you want. I guess I only had one selected there. So I'll make sure to select both again. And then I'll set the orientation to Y so that it doesn't change based on the camera. And there it is. So that's looking pretty good. All right, no issues with that. And now what I'm going to do is actually group this again. So I'm going to right click and just choose group objects. And this will be our kind of master eye look. So I'll just call it eye look. Okay, do the same thing. Rectangle, Y. I'm going to change the aspect ratio here to like 0.25 and make it larger because I want the others to be inside, right? So that way you can kind of get a sense of that these are all together. Now with these controls, I've talked about this a bit where we would like to zero out some of these values. So that way it's very easy to kind of reset. And I'm going to do that here before I start connecting anything. Less chance of anything going wrong if these values are frozen before you start constraining or rigging or creating Xpresso or any of that. So that's what I'm going to do is just freeze all there, freeze all for the individual ones, make sure it worked. There we go. So that's looking good. And now what I'm going to do is select my eyes. I'm going to right click, go to rigging tags and choose constraint. Now we're looking for an aim constraint, and the eyes are going to freak out. Don't worry. Now we'll need to do this one at a time. So I'll select the right eye, and it's looking for a target here. So that'll be our right eye look. And if it doesn't correct itself, what we need to do is just adjust the axis until it does. And once again, I think I got the naming wrong here. So yep, that would be the right eye. Oops. Or we just make it the right and left eye, and that just solves everything. Right, left eye, and we'll try that again. There we go. So that works. And then we do the same thing here. Drag our left eye, look in, and adjust the axis to that positive Y. Now, what you could do is rather than have controls for individual eyes, right, like we have here now, you can test it out, make sure it works, right? And that master eye look is going to control both at the same time. What you could do is use just a single null like this eye look here. And then what you would have to do is use the offsets. And that can be a bit tricky, but that's how you could achieve something like that. Though really, not that much harder to do this. And at this point, we can now kind of rotate this, and you can see he's looking where we want. And on top of that, our coordinates are 0, 0, 0. So if I move this at some point and then I decide, you know what, I don't like that, I can just right click and zero that out. Same with the individual eye looks. If I accidentally do something here and it's looking kind of way off, and it's not ideal that it goes past outside of the bounds of our rectangle here, but hey, if that's what we want, once again, you can just right click if you accidentally moved it and just want to reset it where it was. So that will take care of the eyes. Now we're going to set up an eye blink. And if I was trying to keep this as simple as possible, this may be the one thing that I don't mind just kind of animating by hand, because once you have that first keyframe with it closed and open, it's very easy to copy those keyframes. There isn't a whole lot of variation there. However, if we do want to set this up, here's how I would go about it. I'm going to duplicate my eye look null 2 times. I'm going to the object tab, lower the aspect ratios here, and pull 1 to the top, 1 to the bottom. Probably should be more precise with this, but we can get away with what we're seeing here. And I'm going to name this, let's see, right lid up control. Right? You do want to get specific with these names because it will be helpful when it comes to animation as well as just the setup here. All right, control. And we're going to connect this to the rotation of our eyelid. And so I can see it's the pitch axis here. And we're going to want to end up rotating this 65 degrees or so. That's going to be important later on. But we're going to freeze this now, the rotation. So it starts at, 0. Okay, so freeze that. So it's going to go from 0 down to that 65 I just rotated before. And our control for our upper, at least, is going to go from 0, because we're going to freeze that, down to, say, -3.5, -3 or so. And for the lower one, kind of the same thing, let's freeze. And it's going to go from 0 to, say, +3. I would like to avoid some overlap there. So we may need to come back and adjust those. But with that in mind, we can now set this up and connect these using Xpresso. It's essentially going to be that same set driver, set driven expression we used, but we're going to be doing it ourselves all in one Xpresso null here. So what I'm going to do is drag in my controls. So we'll do lid up, lid lower, and I may want these. Yeah, no, that makes sense as a child of this. Hopefully that doesn't change things, and it does. So before I do anything, and this is why it's important to kind of create your hierarchies and do all of this before you freeze, is to refreeze things. Although I don't think it was going to affect this since it was the X position. Still not a bad thing to do. So we have those controls in here. We'll have to set up what properties we're going to want to use, and that will be the Z position, right? Because the Z axis is pointed up. And if that's a bit off screen, I apologize. Why don't we move this up. So all I did was coordinates, transform, position, Z position there. And we're going to use that Z position along with a range mapper, which we just searched for, to control the upper eyelid and the lower eyelid. And we are going to control on that the pitch rotation. So same thing, transform, this time rotation, pitch, coordinates, transform, rotation, pitch. Now, before we connect this up, I'm going to set my range mapper, okay? With our range mapper, we once again need to think about kind of the types of data we're working with. We are using real numbers, which is great. The input range is going to be defined, user defined, just kind of real numbers near. Same with this other range, except this we're going to want to set to degree. Okay, so we're using numbers for the input, degrees for the output, right? Because we're working with position here, rotation on the eyes. And as I mentioned, the values we're going to want to use here for the lower, 0. For the upper, was it negative 3.5? Well, actually, let's just do negative 3. Okay, and for the lower, it started at 0 because we froze it, and we wanted the upper to go to, say, I think it was 65 degrees. So we just kind of set the ranges we wanted for each of these, where the input was our control, the output is the rotation on the object it's going to be controlling. And we can just duplicate this range mapper because we're going to need a separate one for the lower eyelid, and it should just be a matter of connecting Z position to our rotation here. And if we've done everything right, nothing should move. Okay, and now when we move this, we can see, yes, it is blinking. Okay, and so we would just do the same thing here. Now, the only difference with our range mappers here is we actually don't want this to be negative 3. We want it to be positive 3 because we are moving this control up on the Z axis. So we'll connect that to our rotation pitch again. And we kind of screwed things up because we didn't freeze it. So we get to go back and fix this. So the eyelid, thankfully we can just check our other eyelid for the value. It was negative 197. Okay, put that there. Great, freeze it. And we also just want to double check because I think this is going to be a negative 65 degrees or so. So yep, once again, gotta make sure we keep in mind those negatives and positives. Change them, so that looks good. And so now when I move this up, absolutely working. Okay, and look, you could even set up another control that does both of these, right? So that way you don't have to move both down, one down, one up. It would control both of them. You could also set up another control to where it would do the second one as well. But hopefully you have enough of an understanding from kind of connecting these together that you can see how we can go about that. And the idea was we wouldn't really have to, overlap these. I don't think we quite did that, but it would just be reworking the values we use in our range mapper, not that big of a deal. And so that's how I would set up a blink. There might be a few other things you want to consider doing before kind of calling the rig finished here. Color coding can certainly help when it comes to finding and being able to figure out what controller is for what limb. And so all you need to do to color code or change the color of a null is to select it, go into the basic tab, switch its display color to custom, although you could potentially do layer if you are familiar with layers, and then set the color there. And so what I've done here is for everything on the right side, at least limb-wise, set it to red, left side blue, and that includes the poles, and then just kind of chose different colors here for things like our eye look. All right. No, okay, that does work. Oops. Eye look, the eyelids, that type of thing. Okay. You could take it further by even color coding the nulls the way they display here as well. If you were, just for instance, to say like take our left arm control and do that, you can change the icon color by switching it to display color. would be the easiest way, or even doing a custom there as well. Shoot, you can even change the icon should you want to do that. I thought they had some built-in ones, but I don't know. It's honestly not something I do too much, so I'm afraid I'm not going to be much help there, although I guess there are a few, none that I find particularly useful to what we're doing here. But once again, can help you visually kind of understand what is what, left side, right side, that type of thing. The other thing worth mentioning, and I'm not going to go into it extensively, and it can be a bit tricky, is that you can actually drag different properties onto your perspective view, creating essentially a HUD to help you animate. So for instance, in your user data here, mouth, you can drag that property right into the UI here. And the problem with that is you saw it wasn't lined up very well. And so it can be a bit tricky to set things up exactly, the way you want, especially if you're kind of like OCD about it. That being a little bit off could be very annoying. I know it definitely is to me. But that way we have our controls right here in our perspective view. Perhaps at some point I'll go into a video, maybe detailing this a little bit more, trying to make things a little bit more organized, that type of thing. But just for a quick tip, that's another thing we can do to help keep organized, make it more efficient when it comes to animating and that type of thing. So that will do it for this one. If there's anything else you would like to see, please leave me a comment down below. And if you found this video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you would like it and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, take care.